Hey everyone, you're listening to In the Strike Zone. I'm Jessica Salaji, your host, and this week we're talking about private probation. Now, I want to talk about private probation because it's an issue that I've been really passionate about since I got involved in the justice reform movement a few years ago, and also because it's a growing problem in our communities. And it's really under-discussed. People talk about private prisons, they talk about profiting, policing for profit, all these other aspects of justice reform, but we don't really talk about private probation. And I feel like if more people had more knowledge on the issue, they'd be willing to formulate an opinion about it. And it doesn't even have to be an opinion that necessarily aligns with mine, although I would love for that to be the case, simply because I feel like there is a moral and ethical and fiscally responsible aspect of all of this, which we'll get into. But I really want people to be more informed on the issue. So that's kind of my angle with this episode, is I really want to focus on educating and talking about the system as it is. I'm going to talk a lot about Georgia because we're one of the worst offenders in the nation. But we're going to talk about it from a solution standpoint, a problem standpoint, and a moral standpoint. So, like I said, if you live in Georgia, this is especially important because 1 of every 16 people in Georgia are on probation. And we have the nation's largest probation population, which is kind of hard to comprehend when you think about states that are so much bigger and so much more densely populated than we are. But we're quadruple the national average. And it's partly because our state treats all infractions, even traffic tickets, as misdemeanors. And so they can carry fines up to $1,000 in a year in jail. And in lieu of jail, you can be put on probation. Now, for people who have never been placed on probation, it is a criminal sentence. It's in lieu of jail time. It's provided by a judge during sentencing when you appear in municipal or state court, or sometimes even superior court, depending on what's going on. But it's an alternative to putting you in jail. The goal, what they tell us, is that it keeps the individual from committing more crimes, supposedly, because if you're on probation and you commit a crime, you automatically go to jail, and then you have more fines, and then you're still on probation, and it just creates a mess of problems. So there's that. And then it's also supposed to rehabilitate them. I've not seen any evidence that probation is rehabilitative, but we'll get into that a little bit later. This is something that started a few decades ago. Like, it really took a hold in the 1990s, and it's an offender-funded probation system. So it's supposed to be taking the burden off the taxpayers, which sounds great. But that's really as far as most of the people who talk about this, like our lawmakers and those who are in the judicial system, that's about as far as they go. So when they say offender-funded, what they mean is that people, instead of going to jail and instead of being required to pay their fine up front on the day of the court, they're given more time to pay it off. And these private companies assess a monthly fee, and sometimes they charge for drug testing and other monitoring, and there's mandates and stipulations. In Georgia, this fee program that we've set up through private companies has generated millions and millions of dollars. In 2014, the Human Rights organization, Human Rights Watch, estimated that Georgia's private probation fees totaled $40 million in 1 year. How did they generate the fees this high? Well, before we get into that, let's talk about how bad Georgia looks to everyone. The epicenter of the private probation racket. That's what we've been referred to. Another organization, the Huffington Post, in 2016, they called us worse than the loan shark payday lender groups. They said, and I know not everyone likes the Huffington Post, but even a broken clock is right twice a day. And when it comes to justice reform, you can be a little bit more moderate. You don't have to be hard right conservative. So they said there might be an industry more appalling than the payday lenders who trap low-income Americans into high-interest loans that they know can never be repaid. So what do they mean by that? They mean that, when your ticket is assessed and you get a fine, then you get more fees. Well, if you can't pay the fees on the fine on the day of your court, what makes people think you can pay more over time? So that's kind of where they're coming from. And I'm going to get into some specific examples because as part of my day job with All on Georgia, I attend municipal court in a couple cities, but there's one city that I attend court in every month. and it's in Sentinel County. And the reason I go is because the municipal court judge there loves private probation. You have a speeding ticket, he'll put you on probation. You have a DUI, he'll put you on probation. You have a code ordinance violation, probation. So here's how it works. If you show up, you can't pay the fine for the crime or offense, you're offered probation. The private probation representative is already in court. They sit there and they calculate the cost immediately with you. You sign the paperwork. You sometimes make a payment that day. Otherwise, it's 30 days out. And you get everything rolling. The judge often tells you that you can spread out your fine over 12 months. But the catch is that there's an administrative fee. Now, with the company that I'm talking about in the city that I cover, the fee is $49 a month for the private probation company. So let's say your fine is $500 for easy numbers. And then you have $49 a month for 12 months, which is an additional $588. So if you're paying close attention right now, $588 is more than $500. So you're already paying more in fees than the actual fine. So you pay the $500 plus $49 a month for 12 months, which is $588, which is more than the actual fine. And instead of paying $500 over 12 months, which would just be $42 a month, if you were just on a payment plan with the city or the local government on its own, you're paying $90.66 a month, which is more than double that you would if you were on an interest-free or even a low-interest plan with the city or something like that. So between court fees, fines paid to probation companies, and in some cases, like they make you pay for electronic monitoring, drug testing, anything else, you can pay 2, 3, or 5 times what you would originally owe in fines. Now, these numbers don't sound like a lot to some people, but if you have more than one charge, you have, an expired tag, an expired license. I mean, I understand that these are crimes and they're things that people shouldn't be doing, but the reality is that we all do them. We all speed. Sometimes we get more than one traffic. We don't have our license on us, or we don't have everything up to date. I mean, things happen, and you shouldn't become part of the system simply because you can't pay the fine right then. So if you're one of those people, before we go any further, if you're one of those people who's already irritated and you're mumbling in your head, if you can't pay the fine and don't want to do the time, don't do the crime. If that's what you think, I suggest you stop listening, because, like I said, the reality is that we will always have broken laws in our society, and specifically at the local and county levels. Like, it just happened. There's cops on our streets. We have violations of our code and local ordinances. It just happens. But we're not talking about violent criminals. We're talking about speeding and lapsed insurance and other crimes that can be of a serious nature, but they're not felonies. So we need to talk about how we're going to deal with them. So back to what we were talking about. So in these instances with these fines and this $500 over 12 months plus the $588 over 12 months, the local governments who have the contracts with these companies, they don't even see the benefit sometimes. Why? Because if the payment is $90.66 and someone comes in and says, I want to pay something, but I can't pay it all, I can pay $20 or $40 or $60, the first $49 immediately goes to the private probation contract, or the probation company, per the contract, not the local government or the, quote, victim who's supposed to be getting the restitution. These local governments sometimes never see a penny, but any money that is paid up to that $49 goes to the private probation company. On top of that, if someone comes back in because they haven't paid their fines and the probation company has them come back to court and they go into municipal court jail or they go into the county jail, the city or the county has to pay per day to house that inmate for the probation violation, but the fines and the administrative costs aren't erased. So again, the private probation company comes out on top, and the city and counties are actually losing money because they have to pay for the housing and the food and the medical care or anything else that may come up while they're serving their stint in jail. It doesn't make any sense. So in some states that have been researched by the Human Rights Watch, which is an organization that has sometimes been partisan, but by and large, skates the middle line. If they have unpaid fines and court costs, they say that it can result in a suspended or revoked driver's license. The private probation officers apply payments to probation rather than to court costs, and then they lose their license. And if they hadn't had to pay the private company in the first place, the fine would have already been paid. But now they don't have a license, so it's difficult for them to get to work. And there's just all these factors. But no matter what, the only person or entity that's getting off good in this is the private probation company. They're still profiting. They're still getting their ends meet. So the other problem that always comes up is, well, it's too expensive to offer probation services by local governments to cover it themselves. So I get that. I've heard a number of people at the local level say that if someone can't pay the fine, instead of just sending them to jail at the expense of the municipality again, or having them not pay anything, the community would be better if they did community service, like picking up trash or washing city vehicles or doing yard work, something that doesn't deal with sensitive government information. And that is something that in Georgia, judges are allowed to do in lieu of fine or probation. But going back to the city in Sentinel County that I cover, the city officials who work for the city basically have to beg for the judge to do something like that. He would rather put them on private probation. Now, of course, this is worth noting, I think. I don't mean to imply that anyone is doing wrong, but specifically with municipal judges, they are appointed, they're not elected. City judges in smaller towns specifically are appointed by the council and the mayor, and so they don't have to, because they're not elected, they don't have to file donations or paperwork or contributions or anything that would be transparent-esque. So if any judge anywhere, I'm not saying just the one I cover, anyone, anywhere, if a municipal judge doesn't have to report, we don't know if they're getting any kickbacks from these companies. And we've seen, there's been documentary after documentary, exposés in the Atlantic and all kinds of outlets where we see that judges have inappropriate relations with, be it just financial, not in any other way, but they have relationships with these companies that profit, whether it be private probation, private prisons, just anything. So specifically when you're talking about appointed officials who aren't elected, that aren't accountable to the public, that don't have to follow the same election laws that elected judges do, I think there's even more of a missing trust factor, because at our state legislators, we can look to see who's donating to them. Sure, you can't track everything, and things happen under our noses that we never see, but there's at least an effort to track it, and so we don't have that here, and I think that's a missing component. Getting back to the topic, the almighty dollar and those campaign donations and the dinners and the wining and dining of some of the judges that are elected are probably more lucrative than the weekend trash pickup. It's just like private prisons. And I feel strongly about this. Some things just aren't supposed to be for profit. And they are most equitable and justly provided if they're state run. Especially when you consider that a municipality or the state, or the government rather, is the plaintiff in these cases. There's a reason why your traffic ticket, whether you're in a city or a county, says the state v. Jessica Szilagyi or the city of Statesboro versus Jessica Szilagyi. There's a reason that the government entity, because they're the plaintiff. So the fact that we're bringing this third party in to claim that they are somehow partly the victim or the wronged party, we talked about this in the opioid crisis episode that I did. We're bringing in people and claiming that the victims and the wronged party, and they're not the ones that should be managing or seeking restitution or having an administrative fee just to seek restitution. This is infuriating, and I get really worked up about it. But one of the worst aspects of all of this is that companies have every incentive to keep people under probation for as long as possible because they get a monthly fee every month you're on probation. Most people, they tell you this, and then in court, but most people aren't taking notes when they're in court, and I doubt they ever hear this again. I don't know because I haven't been on probation, but I am making an educated assumption that they don't tell you this. If you pay off the fine in 2 months, they only get 2 months worth of administrative fees. If you pay it off over 12 months, you have to pay it 12 times plus your fee. Paying $250 a month of a $500 fee plus $49 is a lot less than paying over 12 months, but people don't see that because the monthly payment is lower. So they just, these people, the population that is affected by this that we're talking about, that is most adversely impacted by these types of practices, they don't look at things like some people, or they don't have the capacity financially to look at a situation and say, how can I handle this debt as quickly as possible? The whole reason they're going on probation is because their funds are limited. It's just like private prisons. There is an incentive to keep people on the private probation plans for as long as possible, because they're only getting a fee for collecting money. So they want to collect money for as long as possible. It also makes a secondary judicial system that has very little public involvement. So some judges assign companies to prepare things like arrest warrants, and they sign these warrants without reading, and they don't scrutinize them the same way that they would, because they're not your typical search warrant. They're warrants to bring someone back to court, or they're warrants to get drug testing. They're just a totally different system altogether. And so it's this secondary sideshow that doesn't have the same public scrutiny that the regular justice system does. And it begs the question altogether, the justice system. We're talking about putting people in the justice system for traffic offenses and code violations. Should people be on probation for minor offenses, like a speeding ticket and an expired tag? Because, like I said, what happens if you do something else while you're on probation? You're now part of the system. You're going to jail. That's ridiculous. Private probation companies can impose supervision fees, order drug and alcohol tests, and if a person does not fulfill all the terms and conditions of their probation, they can issue a violation of probation and request an arrest. They can request the arrest. The court doesn't say, go get them and bring them in. The probation company does all of this as part of their administrative fee. So if you get out, if you go to jail for not paying and you get out, you're on probation again, and you got to pay longer, you got to pay more for more offenses. It's just this cycle. So now you're in the system and you're not getting out because your fees are astronomical. So the aspect about the drug tests and the conditions that private probation companies single-handedly impose has kind of been rolled back a little bit. In 2013 in Georgia, a judge said that the law does not allow the private sector to impose their own monitoring. So whether it be electronic bracelets or ankle bracelets, drug and alcohol testing, or even counseling. But that hasn't stopped these companies from doing it. So talking about case law, let's get into that a little bit. A 1983 Supreme Court decision, Bearden v. Georgia. Are you hearing the trend here? The trend is Georgia. Georgia, Georgia, Georgia. Why do we have so many problems? Why are we so bad at justice reform? So this 1983 decision, debtors prison, illegal. It reaffirmed that judges cannot jail people for the inability to pay. But the companies bank on people not knowing their rights. And I'm not saying the judges are doing anything. These municipal judges, a lot of times, they don't know their ass from a hole in the ground. They really don't. They don't know the law. I can sit there, cops can sit there, other attorneys can sit there, people can sit there and point out all kinds of things they're doing wrong. And the judges have no idea. They think they're just administering the law and it's no big deal. And, they're just rights. The courts have remedies, whatever. But they will tell you, if you don't pay, we're going to put you in jail. But the Supreme Court has said you can't do that, but they do it anyway. Now, I'll be fair, and I will offer what the supporters of private probation companies say, in addition to cities not being able to afford it or, giving people a payment plan. They say that it's valuable and cost-effective, and it enhances public safety. Now, there are nearly 36 service providers that supervise 250,000 people in municipal, state, probate, and superior courts. There's a judge in Houston County, and he says that private probation companies aren't the ones to blame. And he brings up a somewhat decent point. He says that the judges have to agree to send someone back to jail. The judges have to impose this. The judges, are the ones that set the fines and the terms of everything. They don't have to impose the maximum fine, this, that, and the other. And so if the judges aren't aware of the SCOTUS ruling, which I think is horrifying in and of itself, but if they're not aware, people can handle this in state or federal court. Again, these things take time and money and attorneys, and most people don't know that they have these rights. We're banking on a judge in a system that is flawed, doing the right thing so that these private probation companies stay in line. We're asking the judges to police a company that we're bringing in that isn't technically necessary. It just doesn't make sense. So I'm going to explain a few cases from over the last few decades in Georgia, and I want you to think about whether or not the privatization, as this judge from Houston County said, is valuable. Because I think that's an important word. Is there value? Does this add value? I mean, from a economical perspective, no, it doesn't. You don't add value unless you mine it, manufacture it, or grow it. But I'll give them this. Valuable. So for whom is it cost effective? So let's talk about Orly Hurley. She had an interesting situation, so that's why I'm using this one first, because it is kind of foggy. But she had the $700 fine, but she was working in like a halfway transition center. So she paid $600 a month for room and board, and she had $76 a month for MARTA, laundry, and meals that she was responsible for. And she stayed locked up for 8 months past her 120-day sentence, which, for those of you who aren't good at math, is 4 months. So she stayed in a state facility twice as long because she made $6.50 an hour, or she had a fee of $700, but she only made $700 a month, and she had to pay the state. So the state had to, the state supplements that. So the state's paying more, she's paying more, everyone's paying more, and she ended up earning $7,000 while she was working in this facility. It cost the state $15,000 to keep her locked up for a $700 fine. Who's that valuable for? Here's another one. Fred Slider. He was charged with a stop sign violation, driving without a license, and a DUI in 2014 and 2015. There was like a period of time where he had a couple. And after pleading guilty and serving 10 days in jail for the DUI, he was put on probation to make sure that he paid off his $3,385 in fines. So they gave him an ankle bracelet, and they would check his sweat for alcohol on this bracelet every half hour, even though his sentence didn't forbid him from drinking, but the private probation company decided they wanted to do this. And then they charged him for the bracelet. And he was required to pay $330 a month for this device, on top of the $708 per month for his fines. That's over $1,000 a month for this non-mandated bracelet that the company imposes, and $700 for the fine a month. How is that valuable? Who is that helping? The $330 is net profit, no matter what, no matter how you cut it, for the private probation company. So this last one is not a Georgia study or story, but it does emphasize a top-heavy problem of additional fines. This guy, Thomas Barrett, you've probably heard of him. He was fined $200 for stealing a $2 beer. $200 for a $2 beer. But he didn't have the cash. If he did, he probably would have bought the beer in the first place. But according to the Human Rights Watch, his case was turned over to a private probation company, and the fees ballooned the amount Thomas owed to over $1,000, and despite selling his blood plasma to keep up with it, he was eventually put in jail. So he couldn't pay the fine, had to sell his blood, and he went to jail anyway. So back to Georgia. There's a company called Sentinel, and I want to talk about them for a few minutes because it's related to the next thing I want to talk about, which they recently left Georgia. I don't know why they left Georgia, but they left Georgia after a slew of lawsuits for everything from constitutional right violations to operating outside the scope of their contract. Whole bunch of problems. They left the state. So around that same time, Georgia Supreme Court Chief Justice Hugh Thompson at the time wrote in a unanimous decision that private probation related to these cases. He said that supervision of probation is a function historically performed by state probation officers, and the mere act of privatizing these services does not violate due process. So that's the ruling of a Supreme Court. We've seen state and federal, and we've seen judges at every level of government get constitutional questions wrong. I don't know if this is a constitutional problem, because if it was, then I would say that private prisons are a constitutional problem too, and I'm not sure that that's true. There's definitely an efficiency problem and a moral problem here. So this has kind of caught the attention of lawmakers, but of course, especially in Georgia, not in the way that we would hope. So during the 2014 general Assembly session, municipal and state court judges pushed for changes, and they said that courthouses would be in absolute chaos without private probation, and which wasn't really the talk. The talk was just to limit and to restrict and put some regulations on these companies, which is not necessarily the option. The optimal choice would be for, regional counties to partner together and hold the fees together and share the costs if they're going to offer this type of thing, or to do it in-house instead of privatizing it. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. But Governor Deal vetoed the industry bill that lawmakers sent to his desk on the premise that the legislation would have protected companies from public disclosure on how they operate and their profits. So the next year they came back again. And I think it's funny that during this time, between passage and the veto, there were a whole bunch of donations to lawmakers and to Governor Deal from these private probation companies, but that's neither here nor there now. But so in 2015, they placed a limit on how long someone can be on probation just for the inability to pay. And this Sentinel company that left, they were still here then, began looking for, quote, other ways to look money. Like they asked the Atlanta Municipal Court to move from a offender program or offender-funded program to a system the court would pay $25 a probationer. So now they want to make the system look bad and make lawmakers look bad and say, oh, well, you won't let us, just charge the offenders. Okay, well, we're going to put it on the taxpayers, which is wrong too. So Sentinel invited the court system to increase fines to pay for their fees. So instead of getting out of the business, they just figured out what they need to do to raise money to keep their profits the same. So the Marshall Project eventually reported that this is what ultimately drove the company out of Georgia. And they passed their contracts on to smaller companies, and it's just a little bit different system now, but it's not really that much better other than after the 12 months, the city can't keep collecting, but the company can because it's a private administrative fee. So the worst part about all of this is that it's a monopoly. There's no competition. There's a transparency side of this too. Of the hundreds of courts in the state that deal with misdemeanors, few have competitive, transparent bidding processes for their contracts with private probationers. Dozens of lawsuits have alleged that these companies and the courts that contract with them are sending people to jail for non-payment in violation of the constitutional right to due process. And according to the outline, which has an outstanding expose on Georgia's private probation companies, an ankle monitor, for example, might range from $7 to $15 a day plus an installation fee. And probation fees can be anywhere between $15 and $40 a month. And these dollars, again, go straight to the companies, which aren't required to report revenues or profits to the governmental body they contract with. I think what makes this so frustrating for Georgia is that we've prided ourselves on being a justice reform state, but we still have two of the largest offenders operating in our court systems, the private prisons and the private probation companies. Now, there are some cities who have stopped using private probation. In 2017, Augusta stopped using private probation and went back to a court-run system after a judge was persuaded of the problems with Sentinel and companies like that. And a few years ago, more than 70 municipalities in Alabama, which, how is Alabama ahead of us, I want to know, but they severed tie with private probation companies after a number of lawsuits too. But it's a principle thing for me. It's a principle thing. It's a root governance problem. Why should someone pay over $1,000 for a speeding ticket just to pad someone else's pocket, not to actually pay for their crime? Why should someone spend time in jail for a first-time minor traffic offense? I don't understand. Why do we have unsupervised, unaccountable private companies using our courts and our police to pad their pockets? It makes zero sense for something we call a justice system. And if the local governments aren't even getting what they're owed, you can't tell me this is valuable. You can't tell me it's legitimate, and you can't tell me it's necessary. But if you are telling me that it's necessary, if you're still not sold, these local governments and even the state need to give probationers channels to communicate abuses and a pathway for remedy when probation companies are rigging the system. And they need to make it clear that they have a constitutionally protected right to not be jailed because they can't pay the fine, especially for something like this. So again, what could they do different? Well, local governments could handle it themselves. You could have a regional thing, which would be very easy to implement. I mean, our counties and cities are already partnered through regional commissions for other things. I don't understand. We have regional court circuits. They could partner together to collectively do something kind of like they do with their public defenders and offer that and share the costs. If you're going to offer this, it's something the taxpayers, you can still have an offender-funded program, but the taxpayers and the state need to be running the system so that there is optimal transparency. And then, if you need to have an administrative fee to cover some of the costs, you can do that, but you can show where it's going and you can show with the system that it's providing. There's no reason to continue down this path. There's no reason that somebody should profit off of mistakes like this, off of things that are occurring in our justice system that is funded by tax dollars, and this is operating as a sideshow, like I said before. There's no excuse. Now, I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear what your opinions are on private probation. If you've had any experiences with the system, if you've been a victim of these crime piling programs, anything like that. If you're following me on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, of course, YouTube, you can drop a comment and let me know. That's all for this episode. Thanks for tuning in.